I still think we have the potential for a super cycle. A lot of people got, it's funny, as soon as the market dips one direction, people get really bearish and they're like, oh, what an absurd idea called a super cycle. And I'm like, well, this looks like 2013. And that I would say, 2013 applied to now would be my definition of a super cycle, like a mega cycle, like a super cycle in terms of like either a longer bull run than we expected or a much more intense bull run than we expected. And, if we go 10x from here, we're looking at we're looking at like $400,000 of Bitcoin. That's what happened in 2013. It went from $100 to 1,200, even 12x. So I would say that kind of puts us squarely in sort of super cycle territory, because at $400,000 Bitcoin, I mean, that's basically flipping in gold.
All right. Welcome back, everybody, to Altcoin Daily. My name is Aaron, joined with my brother Austin. And joining us today, friend of the channel, Dan Held. He is a legend in the space, great reputation, been through multiple cycles. Right now, he is the growth lead at one of the top cryptocurrency exchanges, Kraken. Dan Held, how are you doing today?
Doing great. We're still in a Bitcoin bull run, so I'm happy.
All right, good. That's what I want to hear. I know you just recently moved to Texas. How's everything going with that? And how's everything going with Kraken?
Yeah, so I'm a Texas native. I spent 9 years out in San Francisco. It was time to return back to the homeland. It feels great out here. San Francisco is a beautiful, beautiful place. Gorgeous scenery up in the north of it in terms of Napa and Marin Headlands, and you've got Tahoe. But I do miss going to the pool. And in Austin, you can just, your apartment complex to your house, there's a pool always nearby, and it feels kind of fun to just go swimming once in a while. So it feels like summer again. I haven't felt summer in 9 years. In San Francisco, there's no swimming pool anywhere. And so, yeah, it feels really good. It feels good to be home. Loving the Tex-Mex, loving the pool scene. So yeah, it feels good to be back. And
Awesome.
then on the Kraken front, or you could say what's Kraken. But so
insert laugh track.
Yeah, I'm 33 now. I guess I'm turning dad mode. So Kraken's doing really, really well. I don't know if you guys heard, but we just hit 2,000 employees, which is pretty big. Yeah. I mean, I remember when Jesse, back 8 years ago, Jesse and kind of a small crew, the original origins of Kraken. I wasn't there. I wasn't working there at the time, but I knew Jesse for that long. And it's crazy to see how big the company's become. I think it's a great thing. I mean, Kraken's moving along super fast. There's a lot of initiatives that we're doing on the marketing front, which I work on. We're scaling out the team. We've got a ton of great projects. You're gonna see Kraken in more. On the marketing side, you're gonna see Kraken in more places. You're gonna see Kraken's name mentioned more often, and I think that's great because Kraken is that OG sort of culture. I think out of all the exchanges, Kraken represents that the most. We're the only one to ever do proof of reserves, and Jesse is, he's pretty outspoken with how he feels about regulations. So. Yeah, I'm super happy there. Really happy to see what we're developing there and what we're building. And I think you're going to see a lot of cool things come out of the company.
That's awesome. Looking forward to it. Now, Dan has a great YouTube channel that's linked down below. I encourage everybody to go subscribe to him. He releases a video every week. It's not so much news, but more like big picture, evergreen stuff. So you can always return to any old video. It's a Bitcoin focused YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe to that. But let's kick it right off. Dan, how are you feeling about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency these days? What's your take on the current state of the market?
Yeah, so this is my third cycle. I was there in 2013, 2017, and 2021. This feels like 2013. We had a big bull run happen in the early part of the year. Around March, April, May, things kind of come down a little bit. We have a little bit of a retrace. Things go sideways. And I think that's the most torturous part of these sort of cycles is the sideways action. Is it a bear market? Is it a bull run? No one knows, and no one truly knows. I can't predict the future and I don't want to pretend that I can. But this does feel like 2013 where we've got that intense part in the beginning, sideways chop action. And then later in the year, we have a second wave. So it feels like that. I think, structurally, we've got all the things in place for a bull run. If you look at Will Clemente, if you look at Willy Woo's on-chain data, everything looks super healthy there and more indicative of a bull run. When we look at price action, this would be a very, very mild bull run if it topped out at 65K. So I think there's a lot more room to run there. And then on the macro side, like structurally, we've got every single institutional player in the space going, in the mainstream financial world going, oh, we're thinking about buying some Bitcoin. I mean, that's incredible, right? So I think 65 is that first mini peak on a bigger bull run this year. Now, again, this is my opinion. I have no idea what the price is going to do. I have staked a gigantic portion of my net worth on Bitcoin. So if it doesn't work out, I'm certainly on the other, I certainly will feel it. But all of the signs point to that the bull run isn't over, that we should see another, sometime in the fall or winter, another big bull run again.
And Dan, be real with us. Did that 50% correction scare you at the time?
I've hodled so long, man. I knew we weren't going to retrace down to 20. People were calling for 20s. They're like, oh, it's going to hit 20 again. I'm like, it's never done that in the previous cycles. If you're calling for 20, then everyone else is calling for 25, and then other people are calling for 29. And what we saw was like a brief capitulation right at 29, 28, 30-ish, and then bounced right back. So it's funny. Like I don't actively trade. I hodl, and this is why I hodl. I'm not very good at day trading or picking the tops or bottoms. I'm good at hodling, and hodling takes a lot of perseverance not to be tempted to go trade it, right? Like you're fighting this fear and greed. And so I think it's a good exercise of when you feel that pit of fear, that like absolute panic, that's probably the best time to buy. Now, I'm not actively trading out there. I'm just hodling, and I can feel that. I still feel it. You just let the feeling pass through you. I don't think anyone's an emotionless hodler, right? You still feel these things, maybe just not as intense as you did when you first got in. But when you feel that, you're like, wait a second, why am I feeling this fear? Has anything fundamentally changed? And then you go, well, nothing's really changed. Bitcoin is still being Bitcoin, and there's no big event. And then, same on the other side, when things feel elated that it could just keep going up for forever, which what we felt like in Q1, right? If you're actively trading this, that might be a good indication of when to sell, when everyone's like, it'll go on forever, it'll never stop. And so it's so interesting too on the bull run side. So we have these news events that occur, right? Like negative news and positive news during a bull run or bear market. And during a bear market, the negative news punishes, the price downward, but the positive news doesn't do anything. But then in a bull run, it's the opposite, right? Like in a bull run, positive news pushes it up, but negative news has no impact. And we just saw that happen. And I've seen this so many times during these cycles. And that to me is a really strong read that we're in a bull run. We saw US Congress try to pass legislation that was really onerous, and that would be very negative for Bitcoin and crypto. Like that's objective. This isn't a subjective, like that is a very negative, bad thing to happen. The market didn't care. It was crazy. I mean, the market did not care at all. Bitcoin didn't dip. I mean, there might've been a 1% dip or something, but in Bitcoin world, that's nothing. That to me read that very strongly. We're in a bull run. People brushed off the negative news, positive news pushes up the market. And there seems to be a really strong bid there. I feel that every little dip people are buying up. And I think Bitcoin had one of the longest, longest streaks ever of green candles, like green daily candles. Mm. So that really screams to me bull run, and that there's a lot of people who are waiting on the sidelines, and around 30K seemed like the good price to get back in.
And talk to me a little bit more about these fundamentals, because Will Clemente, we've had him on the channel, Willy Woo, we've referenced his stuff. We are showing our audience these on-chain fundamentals all the time, but it's almost like they're not sure if they should believe. But you've been watching this stuff for a long time. Could you speak a little more?
It's kind of like you're painting a picture, right? You've got on-chain fundamentals, you've got liquidity and other things you can look at. You've got news stories and feeling like the fear and greed. These all paint you a picture of what the market is saying now. This doesn't necessarily predict what the market will become, but if the snapshot of right now is representative of historical markets, what we're seeing on chain is really good news. And some of those metrics would be like, are the old hodlers still hodling, or are they selling? Typically at the peak of the bull runs, you see all the older coins start to move to exchanges and be sold. And that makes sense, right? Someone's hodled for a long time. They're wanting to take some money off the table, and you start to see a lot of selling pressure. So you see a lot of like older coins that were formerly dormant, become activated, move to an exchange and sell and be sold. And they're not seeing that right now. And so I think that that's a really strong indication that We've got a bull run ahead of us. Now, there's also more fundamental reasons why that's the case. You're like, okay, cool. Who cares about these old hodlers? How about the new ones? Well, these old hodlers have more coin. And if they're not willing to sell, then that means there's less coin on the exchange for folks to go sell, which means that if demand stays the same and there's less selling pressure, then the price goes up. And that basically the largest hodlers of Bitcoin, they're not wanting to sell right now, which means that there's a lot less supply. It's a basic supply demand mechanic. And so I think with Will Clemente's data, they were looking at like very early, like very fresh cohorts of like 3, 6, 12-month Bitcoiner hodlers selling coin during this downward trend. And that showed more speculator types rather than like long-term hodlers. When the long-term hodlers come out and start moving coins, then that starts to indicate that the market's getting hot and that they believe that, you know, some of the peak might be around the corner.
Yeah, and that is interesting because actually I look back in 2017, the old hodler started selling like kind of even near the middle of the 2017 bull run, right up until the peak. And what you said is true. We haven't really seen those long-term hodlers sell much of anything at this point. So yeah, pretty bullish. But yeah.
There's a lot of other metrics as well. I'm not going to pretend that I'm super fluid knowing all these different metrics, but you've got various other ones like number of new entities on chain. So some sort of methodology to calculate not just new addresses, but new people or new unique individuals. And those numbers look super healthy. And then we've also got like account creations at Kraken and Coinbase, right? Like the account creations they're still very, very strong. I can't give exact numbers, but things are super strong growth wise. And then Coinbase, of course, is public. So that information is well known. We're still seeing very much bull market activities here and bull market sentiment around like people are creating accounts, getting ready to trade, trading and or getting ready to trade. So I would say the retail enthusiasm is still there. It's not as strong as Q2 or Q1, but it's still very much there.
That's what we're feeling too, I think, in YouTube land. But take us through each bull run, not the cycle, but each specific, you know, the bull runs in Bitcoin usually last only around a year. There's one in 2013, one in 2017. Now we're in the middle of one right now, and you've been through them all. How has each one been different in your opinion? And what are the similarities that you see in each one?
Yeah, 2013 was really special. So that was my first bull run. And it went from $10 to $260 in March 2013, back down to 100, sideways chopped. Then around October, November, went from 100 to 1200 by the end of December. What was unique about that one is there's so many structural problems. So Silk Road got shut down in October. People forget that. I mean, that was a big deal. Like we thought, what if that was the only demand for Bitcoin? We didn't know. There wasn't on-chain analysis. There were no blogs. There were no YouTube channels talking about on-chain data at all. So we weren't sure like, oh man, will demand come back? Mt. Gox got shut down too a couple times. It had its Dwala accounts frozen in the US. And I think that was like July, August. And then by February 14, I think they had like fully shut down or like halted withdrawals completely. There was a lot of structural problems. I mean, Mt. Gox was like this giant, they were 90% of trading volume and they were super rickety, and we're just lucky exchange companies like Coinbase didn't get trapped in that. Coinbase wasn't an exchange back then. They were just a brokerage. They created GDAX, remember? And then GDAX became Coinbase Pro. People forget that like Coinbase wasn't always an exchange. They were sourcing coins from Bitstamp, fortunately. But what if they had been sourcing coins from Gox? Like we didn't know that either. I don't think they publicized that. So Gox was a huge structural problem. We had Silk Road getting shut down. That shut down a lot of demand. We weren't sure if our doors were going to get kicked in. Honestly, there wasn't a lot of regulatory clearance in terms of like what we were allowed to do. Now, of course, the Bitcoin network doesn't care. We still weren't sure, being public faces of this new movement, if we were going to have our doors kicked in and then be like, okay, well, we're going to clamp down on this. We understand what Bitcoin is and we think it's a threat. So that was very much the vibe in 13. It was like very like Wild West. 2017, in early 17 is when I think Bitcoin broke. I think that's when Bitcoin broke 1,000. Yeah, I think that's when Bitcoin broke 1,000. It was like January 17. And then that year was just kind of a continuous surge with some little drawdowns. And of course, that one was you've had the huge moment of like ICOs being the narrative. I mean, I was in Silicon Valley and literally the word ICO was being whispered every single place you went to, everywhere. And people were inserting ICOs and tokens into everything. I worked at Uber at the time, and we put together a blockchain strike force team to talk about how blockchain technology could be implemented at Uber. And, we basically this was in 17, and we basically walked away from it going, we don't think it's useful for Uber at all. But people were just like, can we put a blockchain on it, was the vibe then. And there was just so much froth with all of the tokens that it was just insane, right? I mean, it was kind of mania, I would say. Like the vibe was just mania because there's so many coins, 100xing, 1000xing, that it was just mania. What I would say would be the vibe. 2021, I think, is more serious, like kind of a serious tone to it, mixed with a little bit of absurdity as well. Serious because now it's finally mainstream. You've got one of the wealthiest people in the world, Elon Musk, who's into it. You've got his companies. You've got other big billionaires and mainstream investors and hedge funds and insurance companies and some sovereigns. So Venezuela talking about adopting Bitcoin. Bitcoin's entered the final arena, the biggest game, and so things are a little bit more serious in terms of the stakes and in terms of like the narrative. I would say Bitcoin, like content wise, like there wasn't a lot of content before 2017. Like you've got myself and many others and y'all who have great YouTube channels and podcasts and long form content. And there's even like documentaries now. There really wasn't much of that before 2017. It was kind of a lonely existence when you were a Bitcoin hodler. Like I went to the halving party at BitGo down, not San Mateo, I think down in Palo Alto for 2016 halving. There's like 15 of us. It wasn't like as big of a celebration like 2020, where like the halving then was a big deal. There was, even websites dedicated. There wasn't even like a website for the halving back in 16. Like, I don't remember one. I'm sure there was one, but I don't remember one. So 2021, it's big. Bitcoin is big. There's hundreds of millions of people that use it. At the same time, there's the absurdity of the market as well, which I thought was going to go away in the 2021 cycle, but I was very, very wrong, which was in Dogecoin or something, right? Like, retail sentiment to speculate on different assets was more than I ever expected. So yeah, I would say that was probably the more surprising thing, but crypto is now mainstream. Bitcoin is now mainstream. And so I think that's the very distinct difference between the last 17 bull run and this one.
And speaking of history repeating or rhyming, and you kind of already said this, but it was very frothy back in 2017 with adding a coin, adding a blockchain. In a lot of ways, we are seeing that same froth with DeFi and NFTs. Most of it is garbage, in my opinion. Is there anything outside of Bitcoin that interests you, especially when you see publicly traded companies or notable people in the space finding interest?
The DeFi space is, of course, very interesting. And I've done an exploration over there, both on my YouTube channel. So on there, I've done some explorations of, like, for example, Stacks. Stacks it has a really interesting interaction with Bitcoin. There's other ones I'm going to explore as well, which would be Sovereign, so SOV. There's also, like, for example, like Lightning is technically DeFi. I think people don't mentally bucket like Lightning and smart contracts on Bitcoin as DeFi, but the term of DeFi in terms of like defining it is pretty fluid. There's some DeFi projects that have a central control to it, central wallet, as we saw with that gigantic hack last week. So the term DeFi is somewhat subjective, but I would say Bitcoin has a lot of really cool things too, like distributed log contracts are really cool on Bitcoin. So there's a lot of like Bitcoin DeFi stuff that I'm digging into. And of course, studying other DeFi and other cryptos, I've looked at those, studied those. The AMM stuff is super interesting. I feel like some of the AMM stuff is a little bit disingenuous though, where like folks are like, oh, you can throw off this yield on your coin. I'm like, yeah, but if the market moves one direction for a long time, you're going to have a lot more of the other asset and less of the asset you originally posted in the liquidity pool. And they're like, oh, well, you might make up for that with fees. I'm like, well, maybe. But so I feel like some of the AMM stuff is fascinating, but at the same time, I think marketed in a way that isn't completely genuine, where people are talking about these yields, where it's like, cool, yeah, you're throwing, you have these things called like impermanent loss. You also have, it's a lot of incentivized yield, where they're like, cool, we give you our governance token as a way to bootstrap liquidity and incentivize yield. But then it's just a game of choosing, of jumping between liquidity pool to liquidity pool, trying to chase that incentive yield. And so I don't know how long that game can last, right? That game only lasts as long as people buy the token that will, the governance token, to speculate on the governance token. But if that ends, then there's not going to be the governance token incentive yield because people won't want to own the governance token. So, and it's really interesting too, because those governance tokens are like kind of quasi equity, but then they're not equity. So yeah, I'm a Bitcoiner, but these are at least interesting things I'm digging into. I'm still only hodling Bitcoin, but for me, it's at least fun to explore.
For sure, for sure. What are your thoughts on the current state? Could we still be in a super cycle? And what would that mean? Or do you think enough time has passed where maybe this cycle isn't a super cycle?
Great question. I've had a lot of people ask me that. I still think we have the potential for a super cycle. A lot of people it's funny, as soon as the market dips one direction, people get really bearish and they're like, oh, what an absurd idea called a super cycle. And I'm like, well, this looks like 2013. And that I would say, 2013 applied to now would be my definition of a super cycle, like a mega cycle, like a super cycle in terms of like either a longer bull run than we expected or a much more intense bull run than we expected. And, if we go 10x from here, we're looking at, you're looking at like $400,000 of Bitcoin. That's what happened in 2013. It went from $100 to 1,200, even 12x. So I would say that kind of puts us squarely in sort of super cycle territory, because at $400,000 of Bitcoin, I mean, that's basically flipping in gold. I still think there's a chance. I never had the opinion that we were for sure in a super cycle or that a super cycle is destined to be, but that a super cycle could happen. I think it's still a small likelihood, but I think it could happen. We're on the verge of mainstream adoption here, where people can buy crypto and Bitcoin across almost any different platform: PayPal, SoFi, Cash App, Robinhood, Kraken, Coinbase. And the narrative too is pretty strong, where people are like, oh yeah, this is like a legit thing. This is mainstream. What happens when all the institutions in the world start to buy Bitcoin? I think, that still is a possibility. Again, I'm not saying it's a very likely event, but I think it's definitely possible. And us rebounding off of the 30K low, I think reflects that we've still got a ways to go, and that the possibility for a super cycle is still on.
What kinds of things do you think we'll see as we get farther into the more mature stages of this Bitcoin bull run? Are we going to see more institutions buying in, making news? Are we going to see maybe another country, getting into Bitcoin? Are we going to see an ETF launched? What do you think is going to happen this cycle?
I think ETF is off the table. From what I've heard from folks across the board, I just don't think it sounds like there's a lot of resistance to an ETF being approved in 2021. Now, the ETF narrative will certainly propagate even if it won't get approved. People will still talk about the ETF coming and speculate that it might come. So I don't think the ETF will occur. I don't think like central banks buying Bitcoin will be a thing. I think that those two are more for like the next cycle, or maybe if this is an elongated bull run, maybe late 2022. But I do see more and more institutions and corporations buying Bitcoin. I think that those narratives will definitely be very, very sticky, because a lot of people resonate with these different brands, right? If it's Coca-Cola, Apple, Google, like people trust these brands as much as they trust some governments, or even more so. So as they buy, that continues to build this snowball effect of legitimacy. And so I think as the bull run continues, then we're going to see more and more recognizable names get into it, which continues the process. But I do think it's a little early for central banks to be buying Bitcoin. I do think it's a little bit early for an ETF. I hope I'm wrong, but
even though there's ETFs in like Canada already and other places.
Yeah, I'm talking about the US ETF.
Yeah. I would think maybe because we're seeing it in Canada and other places, the US would get to it, but you're saying maybe not this year.
Well, it seems on the regulatory front, there seems to be the SEC seems to want to kind of lean in across a lot of different things. We're getting out of my scope of knowledge in terms of regulatory stuff, but definitely seems like the SEC wants to become more involved across the different crypto assets and different crypto types of investments, like for example, like yield. But yeah, we'll just have to see what the SEC thinks.
Awesome.
I just have one final question. I know we're wrapping up. The obligatory, love to get your price prediction, where you think Bitcoin's going to go, maybe by the end of this year, or maybe you want to do it at the end of this cycle in case the cycle goes into next year, however you think about it. But in the context of this cycle, this bull run, how high do you see Bitcoin going?
Well, if we repeat 2013, we could see Bitcoin hitting between $300,000 and $400,000 a Bitcoin. Now, history usually rhymes, it doesn't repeat itself, so it's probably not going to be exactly that. But if it did, that would be my best price point. So my price point, I would say that I think it's going to land between is probably between 1 and 300,000. But if we match 13 again, it could be 300 to 400,000.
Damn. Dan, appreciate you sharing your time coming on. The link to Dan's YouTube channel is down below in the video description. Final thoughts for our audience.
Well, I've waited 9 years to see this moment of Bitcoin becoming mainstream. This is probably one of the most exciting moments for this space. So definitely stick with it. I think there's a lot of, there's going to be so many different news events that are negative. Just, think about why you entered this investment. If you still want to hodl, do that. Just make sure you're not panic selling because you heard something negative. I've been through a lot of FUD over 9 years, back since Bitcoin is $10. Bitcoin is an incredibly strong asset. It's in a great spot, and I don't think the bull run's over yet. So I'm going to be hodling.
I love it. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thanks for having me, guys. Cheers.